Okay. In young, well, let's not be bashful, in young groovy churches like this one, it's awfully fashionable to be dismissive of religion. Indeed, to people like us, the very word religion is pejorative. It makes us think of outdated, insincere, irrelevant ways of doing this whole God, faith, Jesus thing that we're into, which is all well and good. The problem, however, is that in our dismissiveness of religion, we wrongly assume that we could never become that of which we disapprove. We could never imagine ourselves becoming outdated or insincere or irrelevant. That would be anathema to us. But the fact is that the young, groovy radicals of today tend to become the irrelevant, stuck-in-the-muds of tomorrow. The problem with religion is not that religion itself is bad. It isn't. The word religion simply refers to a supernatural belief around which a person tries to organize their lives. And insofar as we all have a supernatural belief around which we are trying to organize our lives, we are somewhat religious. The problem with religion lies in the attachment we have to the form of it. When I talk about the form of religion, what I'm talking about is the practical ways in which a person expresses their religious beliefs. So, for example, genuflecting would be a Roman Catholic form of religion. Kneeling at communion would be an Anglican form of religion. Abstaining from certain social activities would be a Baptist form of religion. Having coffee and cookies with the most interesting people in town would be a LifePoint form of religion. And yes, I didn't use the word interesting in a good way, I just meant interesting. And these forms of religion are always well-intentioned and they're always helpful at some point or another. The problem, however, is that the people who express their religion via these forms, and we all do, tend to confuse the form with the religion itself. Thus, things like genuflecting or abstaining from certain social activities or whatever it may be becomes what the whole God, faith, Jesus thing is about. It's in our nature to easily confuse the form of religion with religion itself, and in so doing forget that religion in its purest sense is a business of the heart, such as the subject of this morning's study. For the past few weeks we've been working our way through a really great part of the Bible called the Gospel according to St. Mark. And this morning we're in another one of those bits where Jesus has a fight with the Pharisees. And to understand this fight, you have to first of all understand that in the centuries immediately preceding the birth of Christ, the nation of Israel was in a state of cultural flux. Theirs had always been a traditional, conservative, very insular society. And in the centuries before the birth of Jesus, this tradition, this insular way of looking at the world, this conservatism struggled to survive. This handsome gentleman here is Alexander the Great. For those of you who watch the Discovery Channel, you'll perhaps know that in the 4th century, Alexander conquered most of the known world, and he did so with a very specific reason in mind. Unlike other conquerors, Alexander didn't want to take over the world so that he could get his hands on more real estate. What Alexander wanted to do was bring the enlightened culture of Greece to what he considered the savage cultures of the rest of the world. So his great passion in life, his great vision, the thing that drove him was to make the world Greek. And following his premature death in 323 BC, his generals succeeded in making that dream a reality. So in the 3rd and the 2nd and the 1st centuries before Jesus, what you find happening in the world is that it's becoming less and less like the way it used to be, and more Greek-looking, Greek-sounding, Greek-feeling. This is called the process of Hellenization. And in the conservative, insular society of Israel, this process created enormous tensions. For example, conservative Jews didn't particularly appreciate being naked in public. And yet all over Israel, Greek gymnasiums were opening up, where the custom was that you worked out in the nude. In conservative Israel, people didn't particularly appreciate dirty stories, erotic art. And yet all over Israel, Greek theatres were opening up. And they often built highly erotic dramas, and these became very popular. Conservative Jews very much appreciated the learning of the Torah. And yet all over Israel, this learning was being abandoned in favor of the much more fashionable Greek scholars like Homer and Euripides and so on. And so during this period, young Jewish men and women were abandoning their Jewishness in favor of the more sophisticated, trendy Greek culture, the culture of the world. So this would be somewhat similar to a young man in Kazakhstan using phrases that he picked up on Hollywood movies, speaking with an American twang and eating in McDonald's. And the Pharisee movement was born as a reaction to all of that. The raison d'etre of the Pharisees was to preserve Jewish faith and Jewish culture in the face of the now ubiquitous Greek world culture. And in that regard, the Pharisees were aptly named. The word Pharisee simply means the separated ones. Their passion, their vision, was to live a life that was very distinct and very separate from all of the Greekness and the nakedness and the eroticism and the enlightened learning that they saw going on all around them. So being a Pharisee was essentially about looking at the world and saying, that's wrong, that's dirty, that's immoral, I don't approve of any of that over there, so I'm going to separate myself from all that and live a very distinct, recognizably Jewish life. And if I do that, that will therefore mean I'm properly following the God in whom I believe. Mark chapter 7, verse 1. These people, the Pharisees, gathered around Jesus, and they saw some of his disciples eating food with hands that were unclean, that is, unwashed. Now, because the Pharisees believed that Greek culture was inherently immoral and dirty, they further believed that it was impossible to live within that culture without being contaminated by its immorality. So a Pharisee would walk into a public building and think to himself, well, one of the erotic actresses from the Greek theatre may have touched this door handle. And now as I touch it, I am contaminated by her immorality. And as I sit in this seat, well, I don't know who sat in it before me. Maybe one of the people who works out in the nude at one of the Greek gymnasiums may have sat in this seat before me. And now as I sit in it, I am contaminated by his immorality. And so wherever they could and whenever they could, they would wash. Not for reasons of hygiene. Not because they had some OCD thing going on. But purely for reasons of religion. This washing was symbolism. As they washed, this was their way of saying, I recognize that the culture of the world is dirty and immoral, and as I wash, I separate myself from that culture. Now, this seems silly to us, but these people seriously believed that without these washings, the dirtiness of Greek culture would be ingested, thereby rendering them unclean, unholy, and unworthy of being loved by God. Because they believed that, they further believed that just as long as a person washed their hands, And just as long as a person observed other sorts of silly rules like that, then that meant that that person was living a proper life. And this was a form of their religion. We wash our hands. Because we wash our hands, God likes us. We're good. We're okay. We're on the right side of life because we wash our hands. And now Jesus, poor Jesus, yet again, is under investigation for being so blasé about all this stuff. You can well imagine how the conversation begins. There's something about religious people that makes them very good at observing how irreligious everyone else is. Have you noticed this? And so they gather around Jesus, interesting phrase. And Jesus, it has come to our attention that some of your disciples are not washing their hands. Hold the front page. They are of the world. You see, because we notice that they're not doing this religious thing, we're now able to make all sorts of assumptions about them and come to all sorts of conclusions about them. They're not obeying our rules, they're not washing their hands, therefore they're bad people. God doesn't like them. Then in verse 3, for the benefit of his non-Jewish readers, Mark explains that the Pharisees and all the Jews do not eat unless they give their hands a ceremonial washing, holding on to the tradition of the elders. This is interesting. The things that the Pharisees are saying to Jesus are not in the Torah. They're not in the Bible. And neither, for that matter, are a lot of the things that we think are an integral part of our faith. For example, when I was a teenager, I assumed that, and I didn't question the assumption, and it was a very subtle assumption, that things like going to church twice on a Sunday and wearing a sharp suit and having shiny shoes and so on were all an integral part of the Christian faith. And when you're happy with your assumptions, you never think to question them and wonder, well, is any of this stuff actually important? Is any of this stuff actually in the Bible that you say is so very Christian? So notice then that the Pharisees are saying something to Jesus, and that something isn't found in the Bible. It's found explicitly in a body of work called the tradition of the elders. Now this phrase, the tradition of the elders, is a Jewish way of referring to the various layers of teaching that had been added to the Bible over the years to clarify what the Bible really meant. For example, in a later Jewish text called the Mishnah, this thing, the tradition of the elders, is called a fence around the Torah, a protective wall around the Bible. And the idea being was that this fence, this tradition, this wall expounded upon every conceivable situation in life that a person like you and I might need, otherwise we just wouldn't know how to live. This is so subtle. It goes something like this. The Bible is good. We like the Bible. We're for the Bible. But the Bible's very short. It doesn't say everything about everything. For example, there's nothing in the Bible about working out in the nude at a Greek gymnasium. So we better add a little rule there, a little tradition. And there's nothing in the Bible about the theatre. So we better add a little rule there, a little tradition there. The Bible doesn't say anything about Charles Darwin or the dinosaurs. So we better add a little thing there just for clarification purposes, you understand. And the Bible doesn't say anything about the end of the world. It's not clear, so we better add some traditions in there just so that everyone will understand what the Bible writers really meant. And the Bible doesn't say anything about alcohol and tobacco and smiling and listening to music and dancing. So we better add a whole bunch of rules there, a whole bunch of traditions, just so that everyone will be safe. Just so that everyone will understand what the writers of the Bible really meant. And before you know it, over the centuries, you have this entire body of tradition that gets added to the very narrow Bible. And over time, it becomes hard to distinguish what is Bible and what is tradition. What is real and what's a rule that's just been made up. And in verse 4 we get an idea as to how far these things extended into everyone's everyday lives. We're told that when they come home from the marketplace, they don't eat unless they wash. They had a rule about that. And they observe many other traditions as well, such as the washing of cups, pitchers, and kettles. Now, this is the world where Jesus lived. Poor Jesus. At some point, a bunch of people sat down in a committee and said, we need a rule about kettles. I don't know what that rule was, but they had a rule about kettles. Their religion extended into how they did their dishes. So these people, I imagine full of fun, barrel of laughs, come up to Jesus, very upset that he's flouting their traditions, not the Bible, but their traditions. And so they ask, why don't your disciples live according to the tradition of the elders? You see, this is what the Pharisees wanted. They wanted people to live according to their traditions. I have a theory about this. I think that stupid people want everyone else to be just as stupid as them. I think that people who are insecure in their faith and who need their faith to be surrounded by a checklist of things they do and don't do need to push that insecurity on everyone else. They can't handle people who are secure in their faith. Can't handle people who are okay with Jesus and they don't get freaked out by silly little things. There's something about religious people that needs to do this. It needs everyone else to be just like them because it justifies their silliness and their insecurity. Anyway, they say, why are they doing all this instead of eating food with unclean hands? Because you see, unless you follow our rules, unless you're just like us, you can't be following God. You see how they confuse the form of religion with religion itself? In his response, Jesus gets personal, as he is wont to do. He replied, Isaiah was right when he prophesied about you hypocrites. Listen carefully. The word hypocrite simply means to act. In the first century, if you heard the word hypocrite, you would have instantly thought of one of the actors or actresses that played one of the roles in one of the Greek dramas that was so popular in Israel in the first century. You see what Jesus is doing? He's using this word from the Greek theater that was so hated by the Pharisees, and he's saying this thing that you hate is actually what you are. You're actors. Your entire world is a world of make-believe. Now please understand that when Jesus calls the Pharisees actors and hypocrites, he's not accusing them of insincerity or fraudulency. He's not saying you pretend to be something that you're not. That's not what he's saying. On the contrary, these people were very sincere. They were dead serious about the stuff they said they believed. In fact, they were fanatical. The point that Jesus is making is that they are fanatical in the wrong cause. Jesus is saying, you know what, you're actors, and what he means is your life is no more attached to reality than those silly shows you watch on reality TV. Your life, your faith, are about as real as Storage Wars. It's all staged. It's all just useless and meaningless. Your exhaustive rules, your traditions, your sillinesses, your stupidities, it's just a TV show that you made up. None of it's real. None of it's important. And you're living all this stuff as though it actually mattered, as though it was real, and you're sincere, but you're wrong. You're stupid. You're living your life for the wrong things. Then Jesus quotes a passage from the Old Testament that reinforces the point in spades. Quoting God, he says, "These people honor me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. They worship me in vain, because their teachings are nothing but rules taught by men." The issue that Jesus has with these people isn't sincerity, but reality. They're 100% committed to the wrong thing. And so he talks here about the heart. In the ancient world, the heart was believed to be the place where a person made all their decisions, a person's angers, a person's hatreds and lusts and loyalties and faithfulnesses and betrayals and kindnesses and goodnesses and badnesses were all experienced and decided upon and held in a person's heart. It was believed. A heart was where real life happened. And Jesus is saying here, God couldn't give two hoots about whether you wash your hands. God couldn't care less about the clothes you wear to church, or how often you go there, or what programs you watch on television on a Sunday. God couldn't care less about any of that stuff, because that stuff isn't important. All that is silly rules that you yourself made up. God doesn't want any of that from you. He wants what's real. He wants to be involved in that part of you where you hold on to your lusts and your loyalties and your hatreds and your passions and your angers and your kindnesses and your goodnesses and your fears and your worries. He wants the real you. Then in verse 8 he gets really cutting. Excuse me. Okay. He says to them, what you've done with all these silly traditions is in fact a letting go of the commands of God and holding on to the traditions of men. And then he goes on to give an example of what he means. He says to them, you people don't care for your parents. And caring for your parents is biblical. That is actually in the Bible. Be a good son. Be a good daughter. Take care of people when they get older. But your silly traditions and commands have given you get-outs and loopholes that you give yourself a pass from doing what the Bible actually says. And this is so subtle and yet so common. The Bible easily gets subsumed and obscured under our silly made-up traditions, and what often ends up happening is that we follow a bunch of traditions and rules that actually end up running contrary to what the Bible explicitly says. For example, I used to belong to a church that had a rule, and I'm going to quote the rule exactly, because I never forgot it. As a church, we do not condone, the word condone means to forgive, the non-medicinal use or sale of drugs, alcoholic beverages, tobacco, or participation in licentious entertainments. Just a typical Saturday night, really. Right, so the rule is, as a church, we've sat down in a committee, we've come up with this, and not only do we not approve of this, not only do we think all this stuff is bad for you, we don't condone it. We don't forgive it. Now, not only is that attitude not biblical, it is in fact contra-biblical. To say that there are certain lifestyles and habits that we won't forgive is the very antithesis of almost everything the New Testament says. You see how subtle this is? And the real problem with that kind of tradition, whether it is written or unwritten, is that we fool ourselves into thinking that just as long as we're not, in the case of this rule, not partaking in non-medicinal use and sale of drugs, beverages, tobacco, or licentious entertainment, as long as we're not doing that, that therefore means we're following Jesus in this culture. And it doesn't. All it means is we're following a bunch of rules that we made up. For years, I used to think that as long as I went to church twice on a Sunday with a sharp suit and shiny shoes, that meant I was following Jesus. It didn't. All it meant was I was going to church on a Sunday with a sharp suit and shiny shoes. It didn't mean anything apart from that. Nothing. Now I can tell by the way that this text flows that Jesus is getting annoyed. You can imagine. In verse 14, he calls the crowd to him and he says, listen to me. Understand this. The word listen, when used in this way, is only ever used when Jesus is saying something like, right, come here, you, stupid, come here. Yes, you with the small brain, come here. Sit down, shut up, and listen. This is what Jesus means here. Nothing outside a man can make him unclean by going into him. Rather, it is what comes out of a man that makes him unclean. Now, please understand that in the religious world of first century Israel, this is a statement of pure iconoclasm. Jesus is dismantling everything that these people believe. What he's saying here is all that silly stuff that is so important to you is nonsense. It doesn't make the blindest bit of difference in your life. That is not to say, however, that there's no such thing as being immoral and being wrong and having a daft life. It is possible to be dirty. It is possible to be unclean. But according to Jesus, the things that make us unclean are not the things that go into us, but rather, as he puts it brilliantly, the things that come out of us, by which he means our thoughts, our words, our actions. And so Jesus raises the bar on their religious life. The issue that a person has with God is the issue of what a person is, in their heart, in their head. And religious rules and traditions don't touch that. Because all the rules and rituals and traditions of our religion don't touch our heart and our head. In verse 17, the disciples seem to not be getting this, as is typical. And so he says it again. He says, listen guys, the stuff that goes into your mouth doesn't make you bad in the sight of God. In verse 19 he explains it graphically, because they're men and they'd appreciate that. He says, for food doesn't go into the heart, but into the stomach and then out of the body. Now what this sentence literally says in Greek is that food gets flushed down the toilet. You eat it, you digest it, and away it goes, and it doesn't touch your heart. It doesn't touch your head. And since your heart and your head are the determining factor in your relationship with God and your relationship with a right life, then what goes into your mouth has no effect whatsoever. The real issue is the stuff he talks about at the end. He says what comes out of a man is the real issue. For from within, out of men's hearts, come evil thoughts, sexual immorality, theft, murder, adultery. He doesn't do away with the demand for purity, he sharpens it. Greed, malice, deceit, lewdness, envy, slander, arrogance, folly. All of these evils come from inside, and that is what makes a man unclean, and that is where the real issue lies. And the real reason why the BS of church and the silly rules and the traditions that we want to invent are so dangerous is because you can do all that stuff. You can obey every silly rule and follow every daft tradition that the church can throw at you, and you can persuade yourself that as long as you're doing all that, that you've got none of that going on. And we know ourselves well enough to know that that isn't true. Do you know why I think the New Testament is light on rules? And it really is. I think it's because the New Testament assumes that you've got a brain. We live in a culture, don't we, that wants everyone to be as stupid as the most stupid person. We live in a culture where it's now necessary to say on a packet of peanuts, warning, this may contain traces of nuts. We live in a culture where it's necessary to warn people that the contents of a cup of coffee may be hot. A pet hate of mine is ambulances. It's now necessary for the word ambulance to be written backwards so that in your mirror you can tell it's an ambulance. I know it's an ambulance. Big truck, flashing lights, mee-maw, got it, it's an ambulance. I don't need you to spell it for me. I can figure that out on my own. I know that peanuts contain nuts. I know that coffee is more than likely to be hot. I can work it out for myself. Similarly, I know that some stuff is good for me, and that other stuff not so much. I don't need the church to tell me. and neither do you. You have a brain. You have a faith. You know what's wrong. You know what's right. And you can work it out for yourself. And the more you're into the silly rules and the daft traditions, the less energy you have to figure out what is right and what is wrong for you and those you love. Fair enough? Any questions? Any? Okay, listen and listen carefully. Bacon tastes good. Pork chops taste good. Name that film. Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? In the Bible, I'll explain those weird. In the Old Testament, there's a whole bunch of weirdness going on, and you read it and you're like, "Whoa, what is this? This is weird." And I don't do any of this. And not eating pork is just the tip of the weird iceberg. There's much weirder stuff than that. Here's what's going on. The people of Israel are coming out of Egypt, and they're going into a very polytheistic environment where everyone is into a whole bunch of weird and wonderful things, and they're doing weird and wonderful things. The Bible is concerned that as the people of Israel, a very distinct culture, very distinct people group, move into this polytheistic environment, that they remain distinct. And so they're told things like, don't eat what they eat, don't sleep with the people they sleep with, don't sleep with them, don't be into the things that they are into. Maintain your distinctiveness. Maintain your distinctiveness. This is still a concern in First Nations cultures in North America. Bloodline is important to them. The Amish have this concern. Conservative groups are very concerned about this. Let's not dilute our culture by being like them. Okay? So that's Bronze Age. By the time you get into the New Testament, that seems to have been completely undone. Although Jesus said, I have not come to abolish the law, but to fulfill it, the New Testament also says, remember the great passage in the book of Acts? See all this food, all this bacon, all this pork chops, all this bacon, all this pork. It's amazing. Go for it. I love bacon. Bacon is good for you. Life is better with bacon. All right, that's a rule. Any other questions? That's a rule. I think here, it's a good example. It's a common sense thing, right? Does the creator of the universe seriously care about what I put in my sandwich? You know what I mean? Is this the kind of God we worship? Or are there bigger issues? Like, I think my next door neighbor is really attractive and she's married and I want to do some drugs, and I hate people, and I'm greedy and I'm obsessed with getting more and more. What's the bigger issue? You know what I mean?
Is there a reason that was in the book? Was there the reason why he said they shouldn't eat that?
Yeah.
What was the reason that he said we shouldn't eat it?
Well, I'm guessing the reason, and I'm probably right, has to do with the issue of distinctiveness. As I said earlier, when this is going on, the people of Israel are moving into a very mixed, very cosmopolitan, very Las Vegas type of environment. And so the people are told, don't be like them. Don't go to them for anything. Don't ask them for anything. Don't mix with them. Don't socialize with them. Don't watch the things they watch. Don't eat the things they eat. Just don't be like them. It's all about separation. It's all about distinctiveness. That's the reason. Yes?
All good.
Yeah, so the question there is about the respect that we should have for other people's food issues. Yeah, this comes from Paul's letter to the church in Corinth. So the issue there was, say you were a Christian joiner. To be a joiner in Corinth, you had to belong to the Joiners Guild. And once a year, the Joiners Guild had a big party at the god of joinerness. Right? So there's all these temples, and the food would be sacrificed to the god of joinerness. And so some Christians had the attitude, I really can't do this. I can't go and eat meat that's been sacrificed to one of these idols. However, other Christians were like, it's not real anyway, and I like meat. So it's all good. So there was this sort of issue of conscience. And I think the issue, the resolution that the Bible comes to is just what you've alluded to. Let's live and let live. Let's not try and impose our foibles onto other people, but by the same token, let's be respectful. And a classic example of this would be booze. I like a glass of scotch as much as the next man, maybe more. But if I had someone around to my home that was an alcoholic, I wouldn't have a glass of scotch. It's just common sense, right? It's respectful common sense. How are we doing? Time for one more? Yeah, Jeff. One more.
Yeah, the passage, let's say in Romans 3:19 to 21, it says that no one will be declared righteous by observing the law, but through the law we become conscious of sin. I get the sense that the Old Testament is almost like a project to show that we can never hit the mark. Like, we'll put all those rules up there, but no human being is capable of attaining this perfection, and we all fall short of God's glory and perfection. Is that also something to do with what we're talking about here? All these rules, all these regulations, and boom, you guys missed the mark on here. It was a failed experiment in living righteously. Because is it not possible that if there was a human being who could live perfectly righteous, then, hey, maybe you get into heaven regardless, right?
Yeah, it's a good point. That the old reformers used to say that the purpose of the law is kind of like a schoolmaster to take you to Christ. I think what you're meant to get, and this is even true from the Ten Commandments, right? Very reduced form. I think what you're meant to get from the Bible is, I really can't do this. I really suck at this living for God thing. It somewhat depresses me. And that's supposed to create an awareness in us that, I can't do this, therefore I need Jesus. I need Jesus to forgive me, and I need Jesus to make me right with God. I don't know about you, but when I read those, still up there? No. Those lists of things that come out of a person's life, did you read that sort of, oh yeah.
It's up there now.
Yeah, so, right, yes. So some of it, you know, when you read this stuff, you're like, yeah, okay. That's me. I can relate to that. I'm not innocent. I'm not goody two-shoes. I need Jesus. Because I can't do it on my own. Right? That's the point. Okay, gotta go. It's 11:30. Quick announcement.